In ancient Rome, prisons were nothing like the correctional facilities of today. Incarceration was not intended as punishment in itself, but as a means of containment, often preceding punishment, trial, or execution. The concept of serving a prison sentence did not exist. Prisons were temporary holding facilities used primarily to restrain individuals until their fate was determined, and these facilities were grim, dark, and designed to strip prisoners of any dignity they had left. The focus was on intimidation, punishment, and control, with a little regard for humane treatment. Entering a Roman prison, the Mamertine. If you found yourself arrested in Rome, you would likely end up in the Mamertine, the city's most infamous prison, located at the foot of Capitoline Hill. Originally constructed in the 7th century BC, this dungeon was converted from an ancient cistern and became a prison known for its horrifying conditions. The upper chamber, where prisoners waited to be processed, was dark and cramped. But beneath it lay the Tullianum, a circular, damp chamber with a tiny opening in the ceiling. This lower level, described by Roman historian Sallust as disgusting and vile for its filth, darkness, and stench, was often the last stop before execution. Prisoners who were dropped into the Tullianum faced a bleak existence, often starving to death or perishing from disease and neglect. Prisoners were sometimes confined in groups, chained together in poorly ventilated spaces. Guards and officials used these conditions as a tool to demoralize and break the will of those incarcerated. Ventilation and sunlight were virtually non-existent, as prisons were built underground to contain both the physical bodies and spirits of prisoners. This dungeon would have been unbearably claustrophobic and cold, with moisture dripping from the walls and waste accumulating on the floors. Conditions were not intended to be survivable for extended periods, and prisoners were left to suffer from hunger, exposure, and disease in total darkness. The function and purpose of Roman prisons. In ancient Rome, prisons served as holding facilities, not punitive institutions. A prison sentence was unheard of because Roman law emphasized swift punishment, often through public execution, torture, forced labor, or exile. The Roman state saw prolonged confinement as an unnecessary expense. Instead, prisons like the Mamertine were used to contain criminals, political enemies, debtors, and prisoners of war temporarily. Wealthier or higher status individuals accused of crimes might be placed under house arrest, with restrictions but relative comfort, while lower class prisoners and slaves were thrust into public jails where survival was a daily challenge. Types of prisoners. Roman prisons held a diverse mix of individuals. High-profile political prisoners, often leaders of conquered tribes or defeated rebels, were brought to Rome to face public humiliation before their inevitable executions. Vercingetorix, the chieftain of the Gauls, was held at the Mamertine following his defeat by Julius Caesar. Simon Bar Giora, a Jewish leader captured after the Roman siege of Jerusalem, faced a similar fate. These prisoners were usually paraded through the streets of Rome as part of a triumphant procession, only to be imprisoned briefly before being publicly executed as symbols of Roman dominance. Ordinary Roman citizens accused of theft, treason, or other crimes, as well as debtors unable to repay their loans, were also common occupants of Roman prisons. Debtors especially faced long periods of detention if their families could not raise funds to release them, as creditors sometimes maintained private prisons where debtors were forced to work off their debts under inhumane conditions. Many debtors were treated little better than slaves, forced to labor on farms or workshops to pay off their debts, with no guarantee of release. Additionally, Roman prisons often contained prisoners of war. As Rome expanded its empire, conquered soldiers and civilians were frequently taken captive. Some were sold into slavery, while others, especially those of noble or military rank, were detained in Roman dungeons. In times of war, prisons overflowed with these captured enemies, many of whom faced brutal treatment as prisoners of the state. Treatment and conditions in Roman prisons. The conditions within Roman prisons were deplorable. Unlike today's prisons, where inmates have some access to necessities like food, clothing, and sanitation, Roman prisoners had none of these guarantees. Inmates relied on family members to supply food, clothing, and other essentials. Those without family support were left to starve or survive on scraps. Malnutrition was rampant, and prisoners often became emaciated and weak within weeks. Guards provided little more than meager water and bread, if anything, and many prisoners endured severe dehydration and hunger, weakening them before their inevitable punishment. Roman prisons were also riddled with disease. The lack of ventilation, combined with overcrowding and poor hygiene, created an environment ripe for the spread of illness. Infectious diseases like dysentery and tuberculosis swept through prisons, and untreated wounds often became infected. Medical care was non-existent, so even minor injuries or illnesses could quickly turn fatal. Death from disease was common, and bodies were often left among the living until they could be disposed of, heightening the misery and terror of the prisoners left behind. Prison guards, known as treviri capitalis, were responsible for overseeing prisoners and administering punishments. These guards were often corrupt and cruel, inflicting additional torment on inmates as a form of control or out of sheer malice. Beatings, floggings, and starvation were standard punishments, especially for minor infractions or disobedience. Guards also conducted brutal interrogations, often using torture to extract confessions or information. The rack, where prisoners were stretched to the point of dislocation, and flogging with metal-tipped whips were common methods. The goal was not merely to detain, but to inflict physical and psychological suffering. The brutality of Roman justice. Roman justice was swift and unforgiving. Trials were brief and often reserved for wealthier citizens or those of political importance. Lower-class citizens and slaves, however, rarely saw the inside of a courtroom. Instead, punishment was determined by officials who enacted harsh penalties. The legal system emphasized punishment that served as a public spectacle, with the goal of deterring crime through fear. For those awaiting trial or execution, imprisonment was merely the start of a sequence that would end with brutal public punishment. Some of the most severe punishments were reserved for slaves, who were considered property rather than citizens. Slaves accused of crimes, whether minor or severe, faced flogging, torture, branding, and sometimes crucifixion. Free citizens were not exempt from harsh treatment, especially those accused of treason, sacrilege, or crimes against the state. While free citizens could sometimes choose exile over punishment, slaves had no such option, and their fate was left entirely in the hands of their masters or Roman officials. The most notorious Roman prisons. Aside from the Mamertine, there were other prisons and holding cells across the Roman Empire. The Lautumiae, a series of converted quarries near Capitoline Hill, served as temporary holding areas for prisoners awaiting execution or punishment. The Lautumiae were dark, windowless stone caverns that could hold large numbers of prisoners during times of conflict. Prisoners here suffered from extreme cold and overcrowding, and their confinement was often short-lived as they awaited the final sentencing. Additionally, the Romans used military fortresses and temporary prisons in regions outside Rome, especially during wartime. These remote prisons were often even more brutal than those in the capital, as they lacked regular provisions and supervision. Prisoners, including captured soldiers and political dissidents, endured forced labor, starvation, and exposure to harsh weather. Many perished in these makeshift dungeons, their deaths often unrecorded and unmarked. Public execution and entertainment. Roman justice relied heavily on the spectacle of public punishment. Executions were public events held in arenas and forums, drawing large crowds who gathered to witness the suffering of the condemned. The Colosseum, Rome's massive amphitheater, hosted executions as part of its events, often featuring prisoners in deadly battles against wild animals in the practice known as damnatio ad bestias. This form of execution involved prisoners being mauled by lions, bears, or other exotic beasts, and was seen as both entertainment and a warning to potential criminals. The crowd roared in approval as they watched prisoners die, reinforcing the power of the state and its authority over life and death. Other forms of execution were equally gruesome. Crucifixion, a punishment often reserved for slaves and those guilty of the most heinous crimes, involved nailing or tying a person to a cross and leaving them to die slowly from exposure, exhaustion, and dehydration. This method was designed to prolong suffering, with death taking hours or even days. Crucifixions were often performed along public roads or on hills, where passers-by would see the suffering of the condemned. Flogging was another common punishment, both in and out of prison. Prisoners could be whipped with metal-tipped scourges, tearing into their flesh and causing deep, often fatal wounds. For those accused of minor crimes, flogging served as both punishment and a warning. If they survived, the scars would mark them for life, branding them as criminals in the eyes of society. In ancient Rome, prison wasn't a place of correction or reform. It was a stop on the way to punishment, execution, or rarely a chance at freedom. Unlike today's systems where sentences are served in confinement, prisons in Rome were temporary holding spaces, often for individuals awaiting trial, punishment, or public execution. The concept of a long-term prison sentence didn't exist. For Romans, punishment was about public spectacle and swift justice, with imprisonment serving as an uncomfortable and sometimes deadly pause before the final judgment.